Good evening. I am Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of Central European University. I want to welcome faculty, staff, and students from our community, but also an extremely warm welcome to colleagues from other Hungarian universities and members of the Budapest community, members of the diplomatic community, friends of CEU. All of you are welcome. This is an extraordinary opportunity to hear one of the great political economists of our time. Dani Rodrik is in the house. He is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's the author of Straight Talk on Trade, which has just come out in 2018, and the author of a book that had a huge influence on me and on my teaching, The Globalization Paradox, which came out in 2011. He's the author of an awful lot more, but I'll just stop there because we'll be here most of the evening if I had to read it all out. I want to say that this is a joint CEU-Roig College production. Roig College is a wonderful institution in Budapest with a glorious history. We're proud to be associated with Roig College. We have students from Roig College who've come to CEU. I've talked at Roig, and we also have the particular pleasure that Attila Chikan, who is one of the presiding fathers of Roig College, is also a trustee of this university, so it's a sign of the closeness between our two institutions, and he's in the house, and I thank Attila personally for making this possible, because it was Roig that invited Dani Rodrik to come and receive the John von Neumann Prize, which is a great honor, and he received that earlier today. What's going to happen is that it's going to be a conversation between me and Dani for a little while, and then we're going to open out to the audience. The event will end promptly at 7:30, and then, as usual, it will be followed by a reception, a glass of wine, CEU hospitality in 13 next door. Hope you'll all stay. Dani will be able to stay for a minute, and you can talk to him then. Let me just try and set the stage momentarily on the connection between this and Rethinking Open Society. This is part of a 17-month exercise, which is slowly coming to fruition and conclusion, in which this university that has an open society mission has spent a lot of time publicly thinking, what does that stuff mean? What does open society mean? Why are so many people challenging that as a model of a good society? How do we engage in that inner debate? As I've said throughout this exercise, a university is not there to promote an ideology. It's not there to even to promote a vision of a good society. It is there to constantly question the basis of its own received assumptions. The core of open society is really an attitude towards knowledge, a belief that you cannot have any kind of free society unless it's based on a rigorous, relentless attempt to distinguish knowledge from opinion, from rumor, from fantasy, from ideology, from dogmatism. And that is a lifelong struggle. And that's the core of what believing in an open society is, believing in the struggle to find out what knowledge is and then use that knowledge as the basis for public policy decision-making in an open and free society. So that's what we're kind of trying to do, and that's what we're about to do now. And I hope after initial set of questions, you'll join in with questions of your own. And so I'm now going to sit down, and we're going to do this. We've had Ann Applebaum in the House asking why single-party states are resurgent in even democratic societies. We've had Thomas Piketty here a month ago talking to us about why liberal democracies have seen such a startling, even alarming growth in inequality, parenthetically telling us quite a lot about the role of universities in credentialing inequality in open societies. And I guess that you're here to talk to us about the ways in which, going back almost 200 years, the idea of a free society, an open society, if you go back to Adam Smith, it was always connected to the idea of what Smith called a natural system of liberty. That is, an open international economy in which you reduce the barriers, non-tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, all the barriers that impede circulation of goods in a global economy, and it was already a global economy 200 years ago, that had a necessary connection to freedom domestically. If you could knock down those barriers, then an international open economy would produce an open society at home. And that's the core thing I wanted to work with you on, because that's in question. And I guess my opening question is kind of why that is, why that automatic assumption that if you have an open international economy, you'll have an open society at home, and the two feed on each other. Why is that assumption that is now 200 years old suddenly in such trouble?
Great question. Well, Michael, let me first say that I'm delighted to be here at CEU, so I want to thank you for your invitation. I've long admired this university as a center of research, scholarship, and free inquiry here in Budapest. So I'm delighted to be a guest here this evening. So you're asking the question, what's the relationship between essentially a free market order and a free society? And how does the argument for the relationship between a free market and a free society domestically in turn relate to its international counterpart? I think when Adam Smith was laying out his arguments for a system of natural liberty and an argument for essentially free markets, he was also very clear, although it's the part of his argument that I think many economists forget to read, that a market system is always based on also a system of a public order. I forget exactly what his words were, but I think he talks about a sort of tolerable system of the administration of justice and many other such things. And of course, over time, the nature of a market society has changed, and our conception of what that public order requires and its extensiveness has also evolved. So it's no longer simply a tolerable system of the administration of justice, but extensive safety nets, a regulatory apparatus to take care of the extremes of markets. So the kind of the markets work best in a national setting, effectively, when they're embedded in this public order of rules and regulations. And as long as those complementary institutions are in place, I think there is indeed a kind of a harmonious balance between a market society and an open society in a political sense can perhaps be achieved. Now, I think the trouble is that it's difficult to extend this idea quite the same way into the international sphere. So you might be tempted to say, well, what about just allowing the same system of, let's take the idea of a free market and make it turn into an idea of a free trade between nations. But of course, the question is, where does the public order that's going to back up the system of free trade internationally, where is that going to come from? We don't have the equivalent of a global political community in anything except for a very metaphorical sense. And so we don't have any of the mechanisms of stabilizing, regulating, and legitimizing markets internationally that we have domestically. So I think the tension comes when, as a result of this, we push the argument of free trade beyond a certain point, and we can talk about what that point is, beyond a certain point where we have a system of economic globalization that is a patchwork of, on the one hand, complete lack of public order arrangements. For example, the absence of common harmonized system of labor market regulations or environmental regulations, the sense that the competition takes place under a level playing field, the complete absence of that internationally because of jurisdictional boundaries and regulations across countries are naturally so different. So on the one hand, a complete absence of these complementary regulating institutions. On the other hand, an overreach on the part of certain interests, in particular multinationals and big international corporations, to create the international equivalent of a public order, but which is particularly partial to their interests. So you get push for the investor state tribunal system. You get a push for intellectual property rights regulation, which are sort of essentially one-sided. You get push for the openness of capital accounts and the rewriting of domestic financial regulations in ways that's going to benefit financial capital and so forth. That's a highly unbalanced system of rights, or a very asymmetric order of public regulation that privileges certain interests to much greater extent. So I think it's this. That's, I think, where the analogy fails, that we don't have anything like the global equivalent of a legitimized public order. Right. That creates these the fundamental problems of advanced economic globalization.
But you go, you're putting it in a benign way, in a way. But I've heard you, and I'm going to quote from your book, put it in a much sharper way. And let me push you there. This is quoting you. Quote, "We cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, national determination, and economic globalization." It's a famous sentence of yours, going back to the globalization paradox of 2011. Explain to us why not, because that's pushing it very hard. And people might say, Dani, you've stepped a step too far there.
Well, I mean, I think the right way to think about this is that the vertices of that trilemma, if you will, are idealized forms of each of these arrangements where, when I talk about globalization, I really mean that the sort of a kind of hyper-globalized world where there's absolutely no difference between an international market versus domestic market. We're obviously not there. Similarly, when I'm talking about, democracy, I'm talking about a system that is fully and perfectly accountable and responsible to domestic electorates in ways that I think many democracies actually fall short of. But I think what the trilemma that you quoted gets at is the notion that there are these trade-offs. So we economists are, of course, love trade-offs, or to talk about trade-offs. And I think that the trade-off that the trilemma points to is that every time we're trying to integrate our economy with the economy of others, that process involves essentially removing the various kind of transactions costs associated with regulatory discontinuities. So to put it very concretely, if I want to maximize the amount of trade and foreign investment I want to have, I essentially have to commit to pursuing economic policies that are never going to impose any restrictions, either explicit or implicit, because I may have a different tax rate or different regulations or different product standards than my trade partners, and traders and investors are going to complain that these are essentially barriers to trade because I'm making life difficult for them. well, if I'm essentially responsive to this, or if my monetary policies are run so that I want to have completely fixed exchange rates, so I don't want exchange rate volatility to interfere with trade and introduce uncertainty, I'm essentially progressively hemming myself in terms of what I can do. So it's not that national sovereignty disappears, it's that the national sovereign, the public order that's required to maintain freedom of international trade and capital is provided by a national sovereign, but for the purposes only of maximizing international trade and investment. And when the domestic claimants come knocking on the door, I want more employment, so please pursue a more expansionary monetary policy or reduce your interest rates. I can say, sorry, I can't do that because that would mean giving up on the parity. If others say, well, these financial, short-term capital flows are killing him because they come in and out and they wreaking havoc with our economy. Say, that's freedom of capital flows, I can't do anything. Or if workers or unions show up at my door and are saying, you're forcing, companies are telling us that they will outsource to go to countries where labor and environmental standards are much lower and labor rights are not protected and the governments are subsidizing them, unless we provide concessions in terms of our working contracts and our labor standards, do something to restrict that kind of outsourcing, you have to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that because that would violate free trade. So I think that's essentially where the problem arises, the conflict between national democracy and economic globalization is not that globalization necessarily limits what governments can do, because governments can legitimately delegate in order to improve the performance of their own democracies. But what
do you mean by delegate? Sorry, I didn't follow that.
So, let me give an example that I think might make sense. So the tension between democracy and globalization, I think, doesn't arise from the fact that a global economy or global rules or economic globalization narrows what the government can do. That's not the whole argument, because you can argue that executives and political governments, political authorities always delegate some of their powers. So the classic example is delegating monetary policy to an independent central bank. Right. And so the political executive saying that I'm giving up the right to conduct monetary policy on a day-to-day basis because I was screwed up so badly. Right. Therefore, it's better to have my technocrat or an independent central bank run my monetary policy more autonomously. So this is the notion of democratic delegation. You're limiting what the executive can do, but in order to enhance the functioning of your own democracy. So I think the suspicion with a lot of economic globalization is that many of the analogous delegation to international trade agreements or to international norms of financial globalization aren't necessarily to enhance the performance of national democracies, but simply are handouts or privileging of particular corporate interests, or they are very asymmetric forms of globalization.
But we're actually delegating sovereignty to Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Mercedes. I go along.
Yes. I mean, I think that's certainly one element. So that one consequence of financial globalization essentially has been that we have opened the door to an inordinate amount of evasion of taxation by these large corporations that now they are pretty free to book profits in the lowest corporate tax environments, regardless of whether they operate there or not.
And that then empties out the public sphere. I mean, it empties out our capacity of national governments to invest in roads, schools, whatever, because the corporate sector is
That's right.
What's it doing? It's not triaging.
It's engaging arbitrage.
It's engaging in arbitrage.
It's engaging in arbitrage, and I think so. So that's a lot of this necessarily undemocratic nature of this is this engagement in arbitrage. It's clearest in with respect to taxes, and therefore you can look at corporate tax rates around the world in the last 20 years or so. Basically, they've come down everywhere. They're not identical yet, but this is very real tax competition. But it also happens in very subtle ways in other areas as well, in terms of labor standards, in terms of regulations and products.
Let me tell you a story about labor standards to kind of bring this home. You're talking about it from an economist's point of view, but as an ex-politician, let me tell you what it's like from a politician's point of view, just momentarily. Almost the worst moment of my political life, and I had a bunch of bad moments, but the worst one morally was showing up in a small town in southern Ontario that had built its entire existence for 40 years around a steel mill run by U.S. Steel. These people had enormous pride in producing steel at a certain unit price and being extremely efficient. U.S. Steel then got a deal with the state of Indiana, a union-free state, and simply moved steel production to a place where unit costs were lower because they didn't have unions. Yeah. And you're an elected politician, you sit in a room with 400 steel workers who just lost their jobs, and the question of whether the whole of democratic politics rests on the premise that I, an elected politician, can do something. Right. I could do squat about that, right? Right. And that's why the sentence that I quoted a while ago is deeply meaningful to me, because it just it was like a plug being pulled out of the legitimacy of a democratic system. These people were sitting there saying, we elect politicians to do something about that. You can't do anything. And all I could say to them is what every liberal democratic politician has said for 60 years over this: we'll give you retraining, which is a hell of a thing to say to someone who's 55 years old, right? Who thinks, and who's got a high school education, is proud of the work that they do, and suddenly nothing.
Michael, you
That's
probably
why
know,
what you're saying has struck such a personal chord with me.
There's another chapter to this, you probably know. Now that NAFTA is being renegotiated, part of the Canadian negotiating position in NAFTA is the outlawing isn't the right word, but making it NAFTA illegal to have right-to-work laws, so-called right-to-work laws.
Bingo.
Those are basically rules in certain U.S. states that make it very hard for unions to organize. And that's part of the ruling out such arrangements is part of the Canadian. Of course, the chances that the Americans will accept this is virtually nil. And then the question becomes, what do you do then? Do you still go with an agreement that ends up being highly partial? So the flip side of this is that the NAFTA also provides significant benefits to international corporations to be able to sue the Canadian government, as you know, through the investor-state dispute settlement. And there have been many, many cases where the Canadian government has been at the has been sued, and many cases where I think there's been hundreds of millions of dollars that have to be paid out to the corporations.
Well, this is the engine room of a thing that, of course, will be fascinating to Hungarians: the future of Canadian democratic sovereignty. Right? This is, so. Lest we get trapped in a Canadian discussion, I wanted to shift slightly to something that's close to this, which is your critique of globalization and its impact on democratic sovereignty and legitimacy is coming from the center-left, although you're a nonpartisan person. But there is a kind of critique from the right, and it's being vocalized by Donald Trump and others. That's why NAFTA is being it's not being rewritten from the left, it's being rewritten from the right, and that right-wing or center-right critique of globalization is leading to calls for protectionism around the world. How would you contrast the critique of globalization that you've made from your position with this one from the right?
I think first that the economic anxieties on which both types of populism build are not that different. I think it's the kind of the decline of the sense of economic opportunity for large segments of the working class, increased economic anxiety, the sense that economic and social distance between them and the technocratic, professional, and financial elites has grown. But those anxieties don't come with a particular necessarily narrative attached to them, and I think it's then the politicians and the popular and parties provide a kind of narratives, and the narratives can be, broadly speaking, of those two kinds. So the left-wing narrative is in fact the oldest form of populism. It goes all the way back to the late 19th century in the United States, where the first self-consciously populist movement in history was actually an American one. It was the People's Party, and famously, of course, they targeted the gold standard, which was the globalization of the time. For them, the enemy was that the gold standard forced what today we would call austerity policies, very high interest rate policies, and they wanted to get rid of the gold standard so that the government would be free to pursue more expansionary policies to bring down the interest rate burden of the farmers. So there again you see, but the enemy there was not immigrants or minorities. The enemy were the financial elite. It was the New York bankers.
And there's a great song from the 19th century from that place, which has one line: "Some people rob you with a 6-gun, and some people rob you with a fountain pen." Exactly. And we know who that is. That's from that populism
era, yes.
of the left of the 19th
yes,
century.
That's right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut.
Yes. But you can take the same grievances and then wrap them around a different kind of a story where your problems aren't necessarily caused by the bankers or the large corporations or financial interests, but instead it's the outsiders, that appeal to a primordial sense of us, appeal to ethno-nationalism and point the finger at immigrants and refugees and I think, I will be very upfront here, and I think there are times where left-wing populism is called for. After all, the New Deal in the United States, which was sort of historically the child or grandchild of the populist movement via the progressive movement, was a kind of a version of a left-wing populism, and it performed a very valuable function of reinventing capitalism for the 20th century by expanding the safety net. So I think we are at a point somewhat like this, where that we need to re-envisage once again how our market societies are going to work. So I think I prefer to see sort of a left-wing populism that tends to be more inclusive, as opposed to a right-wing populism that essentially lives off of ethnic and religious or ethno-nationalistic cleavages and rely on the existence of these cleavages as its justification, and therefore is always inherently divisive.
Right. Let me move you along towards from diagnosis to so what do we do? Because one of the sentences in your book that's given me a lot of thought is getting the balance between economic openness and policy space management, getting that balance right is of huge importance. So you want an open international economy, and you want to preserve what you call the policy space so that democratic societies can give their citizens a sense that they're not kind of helpless pawns in a kind of global tide, and that sovereignty is returned to people. How do we start to, can you lay out what the essential elements of that, getting control back of the policy space?
Yeah. I should say that I think the limitations are as much cognitive and epistemic as they are real. That is, that I think there are a lot of things that governments can do even in the existing system. That, for example, going back to our discussion of tax competition and tax havens, if governments were serious about taxing large corporations, there were a lot of things that they could do on their own that would not require actually international tax cooperation. So there are tools that are available.
But how do we avoid the arbitrage problem? If Canada sets its corporate, or let me stop using Canadian examples. Hungary
Yeah.
tries to set a, well,
Hungary
wants,
is a beneficiary of the system because it has a very low corporate tax system.
Hungary wants to do what developing economies do, which is undercut.
Yeah.
But
So
how would Hungary, how would Hungary create the policy space you're thinking about?
Well, I mean, Hungary is the beneficiary of other countries' large, higher corporate tax rates. So this is not the solution for Hungary because Hungary benefits by having a very low corporate tax rate and having a lot of profits being booked in Hungary. And actually, as a result, having a relatively large amount of corporate tax revenues because of. But the question is, what does a country like the United States do or Canada do, which have much higher corporate taxes? And what they could do is simply, and this is, by the way, a proposal of Gabriel Zucman at University of California at Berkeley, which is to simply apply a tax to large international corporations that is a share of their global profits, which corresponds to their domestic sales in the market. So if you're in the United States, you're a large international corporations, 50% of your sale is in the US market. I'm going to take your global profits, multiply it by 50%, and that's the share of your profits that is going to be taxed in the United States. This can be done unilaterally, independent, and it doesn't matter. It's, you cannot avoid it by booking profits in different jurisdictions because the base is going to be still your global profits.
Is there a first mover problem though here? That is, that's a smart thing to do.
Yeah.
It's probably the right thing to do. It goes at the arbitrage problem, recovers policy space, but it's kind of après vous, Alphonse. I'll do it if you do it, if other people do it. Is that the political problem?
I think the political problem here is that as in fact happened in the United States, when the government, wants to move in this direction, and this is one of the most powerful, governments in the world, right? The corporations basically say, we're going to spend so much money lobbying against this that you'll be sorry you started it, literally. So it's partly the financial power of these corporations, and partly, frankly, what I was saying before is a kind of a cognitive capture that there's the sense that that we have to leave these companies relatively happy. That we don't want to fight them. That this is the world where foreign investment and trade are so important that we don't want to mess with that too much. And I think that's the narrative that I think has to be fought by preferably left-wing narrative.
Is there cognitive capture in the economics profession? Is there cognitive capture in universities?
I think there is certainly cognitive capture in economics as well. But I mean, I think if you have frankly, I think on most issues, if you have 5 economists in the room, you have 6 different views. So so the question is always going to be whose voice gets heard. Which economists are you going to be relying on? So unlike the public picture of economists, which is sort of that they're all united against free trade, all united in favor of free trade and economic globalization, actually there's a lot of diversity of views on this. But the problem is not that the economist's voice is dominant. It's that we sort of get to hear a very selective view, partly because
the cognitive capture or the incapacity to act and create policy space and use it is much more in policymakers and politicians, and it's driven by essentially fear of corporate power. Is that what you're saying?
That's the negative side, but the positive side is faith in corporate power. That that's foreign trade investment is the way to develop and grow, and you want to keep these corporations. So in a way, what has happened, I think, is that I don't like the term neoliberalism very much, but I think it is a real thing. It evokes this notion that this public consciousness that the way to move forward is to allow markets the maximum amount of free space, and restrain the governments from doing things that would really make things worse. And I think the neoliberal consensus has very much evaporated. So it's not like the professional elite, but nothing has replaced it. Sort of when the Keynesian consensus dissipated in the 1970s, then you had Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s. They were the original neoliberals, and then sort of that there was a hole. Then you got the Washington consensus, and now we're sort of, I think we're living in kind of a transition period where we don't have an alternative narrative that let's say, if you will, the progressive forces have not been able to formulate an alternative narrative to appeal to what are some deeply felt and real legitimate anxieties. And I think part of the success of the nativists and ethno-nationalists is that, they have an alternative narrative that they say very clear-cut: we are for nationalism, we're for protection, we're for the sense of us, and this is who we are. And it's a much simpler and perhaps on the surface more compelling narrative.
But one of the characteristics of your writing as an international political economist is when you talk about, we've been talking about policy space and how you create policy space, you're pretty clear that the policy space you're talking about is the nation state.
Yes.
You're not a nationalist,
yes.
but you're saying, come on,
yes.
the only political unit that we can count on to protect citizens is the nation state. That's not a move characteristic of well, it's not been a particular characteristic often of the anti-globalization critique from the center left. Why is the nation state so important to you analytically? Why is this the vehicle?
I think it's a very simple answer. I mean, I think it's because our bodies of democratic deliberation, decision making reside at the level of the nation state. That's so so I emphasize the nation state not because I believe in sort of primordial sense of nationalism, but I think that the issue is going back to where we started. Markets always have to be embedded in systems of governance, and therefore the question is who's going to write those rules. And that's going to have to be a collective process. What is the institutional landscape that is going to allow that? We have nothing globally. Now you might say, well, why don't we push for having those representative bodies more globally? But I think, I think one can come up with a principled reason for why it's desirable to have a world that's divided into multiple nation states, although it would be very hard to come up with a principled justification for the existing division into the existing kind of nation states. But the reality is that when even the European Union is finding it nearly impossible to create the kind of transnational political community that would really underpin a truly economic union, I think, thinking that this could be done on a global level or regionally elsewhere, I think it just doesn't seem to me very realistic. So for good or ill, those are the only representative institutions that we have are at the level of
But isn't there, I mean, the counter to what you're saying would be precisely Europe. If you ask who is the international regulator that is trying to do something serious about digital power or digital oligopoly, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, the lot, it's Mrs. Vestager and the European Competition Commissioner. So then that's an argument that says, no, the nation state can't be the policy space. We've got to aggregate some. We've got to get the market power of 350 and 27 states if we've got a chance to make sure that these big corporations start listening to democratic concerns.
Right.
I mean,
so
what do you make of that kind of claim?
I at the time that I wrote the globalization paradox that you quoted from back in 2011, I thought that the European Union was in fact the only exception to sort of my practical and very pragmatic conclusion that the nation state was where the action had to be. We better acknowledge it and live by it. Because I thought, indeed, that the European Union was on a path where the process of political community building would eventually catch up with its economic integration. Now, that has not happened, and in fact, I think the way that the euro crisis was managed set that process back significantly, because part of the management was, the creation of a kind of a morality tale that there were good countries in the EU and bad countries, those who were thrifty and hardworking, and those who cooked their books and therefore weren't trustworthy. And rather than building a sense of European solidarity, I think the way that the euro crisis was managed fanned the flames of nationalism. So I think,
But hang on, because someone might come to you and say, now you're having it both ways. On the one hand, you like the specificities of nation states. The policy space created in Germany is the product of Weimar, massive inflation, catastrophic depression, economic collapse, Hitler, right? Yeah. So that's why you get this moralizing. The Germans then think, we've had a policy space that gives us that national experience. We look south, or we look at the Greeks and we think, you gotta do it the way, so that you can denounce the morality story that the Germans inflicted on the rest of Europe, but that comes precisely from the very strength and cohesiveness of the national policy space that they created historically.
And you may well be right, and if that is true, it is an argument against economic union, because I don't think the economic union can be maintained indefinitely without corresponding degrees of political and fiscal community building at the same time. Now, I'm not so sure whether that was a foregone conclusion, because I can tell a story where the reaction of Merkel to the euro crisis, instead of being that of a Schwabian housewife and everybody should take care of their budget balance, could have been to say, look, this crisis is a crisis of economic interdependence. If the Greeks overborrowed, German banks overlent. So this is not a straightforward black and white morality tale. If there were mistakes on the part of the Greeks and the Spaniards and the Portuguese, there were mistakes on the part of French banks and German banks. And therefore, the lesson of this is that we have to learn that our economic interdependence is built on very weak institutional foundations. Let's use this as an opportunity to complete and strengthen those institutional foundations. I don't know if that would have worked. I don't know if she would have lost the next election. But in principle, there is an alternative narrative that might have been more conducive to European solidarity.
Let me prepare the audience that we're going to go out to questions shortly, so get your questions ready. I want to pick up a couple of things. Again, looking for, let's be positive. At one point I think in your most recent book, you say, we need a globalization that is, quote, regulated by a thin layer of simple, transparent, and common sense traffic rules, unquote. I like that a lot, but I wasn't too clear give me an example, some simple, transparent traffic rules for a global order.
If you want to really think about it concretely and to really convince yourself, everybody, that this is not, some pipe dream or, impossible thing, think of the GATT regime. Think of what the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade did. When you think about it, it's really amazing that it worked at all, because it didn't have any enforcement. It was a very limited set of rules. It left the bulk of trade outside any disciplines. Developing countries could do whatever they want under their own exceptions. It was mostly advanced countries that liberalized almost exclusively just their manufacturing trade, because agriculture was left out too. And then in manufacturing, when garments came under sort of pressure because now Korea and those East Asian countries, they carved out garments and put it under a special regime where you could actually do protection. So that's, seems like, a system that could not have worked. This is an example of a very thin set of rules, right. But it worked exceptionally well. Under the aegis of the GATT, the world trade multiplied, grew much more rapidly than world incomes. World investment, direct foreign investment, grew by leaps and bounds. I think one interpretation of the GATT experience is that precisely what the GATT did, established some minimal set of rules and expectations, limited to barriers at the border, didn't get into your investment regime too much, didn't get into your intellectual property rights, your environmental regulations, didn't establish separate investor courts, but that by essentially providing the space for developing countries to rebuild and restructure their economies, for the advanced countries to build their own welfare states and their social contracts, you built a very healthy and growing, expanding world economy on top of very relatively healthy societies. And I think that's the right model for globalization, that you cannot have the global economy thrive if the constituent units, the nation states, aren't thriving. And so it has to be built, every system, a global system of rules has to be built on sort of global rules that's going to enable that.
Doesn't GATT and the simple kind of, didn't the GATT model depend on an American hegemon? And if you're in a post-imperial world, a post-hegemonic world in that way, the idea that you can get simple rules like that, again, who's going to start, who's going to put it in place, how do you get it going?
I don't think, I think now that China is in fact a rising power, and there is real competition and the United States is not so hegemonic, I think we need all the more something like the GATT, because the philosophy behind the GATT was, you do your own thing, I'll do my own thing, you don't get to say much about what I do. Now, if what I do is egregiously bad, then you get to complain, and I commit to not to be doing egregiously bad things. This is, consider what we are facing right now between the US and China, okay? Now, this US conflict, the trade conflict between US and China would be taking place even if Trump wasn't the US president. And the problem at its root is the fact that this WTO model of deep integration that we have currently is predicated on this peculiar Western and in particular American notion that China would become more like us. In other words, their system would become more like the American system. They would abide by the same rules, and therefore trade with them would not be controversial. Well, lo and behold, it turns out that the Chinese don't want to do that for very good reason, that they think they know how to manage their own economies, and with growth at 9% for so many decades, I think they're right. And so if they want to say, we don't want to live by your own intellectual property rules, we don't want to live by your own investment rules, we don't want to live by your system of regulations, I think frankly, the rest of the world should say, you have a point, and by the way, if you grow rapidly, in the end, you create more market opportunities for us because, China has done more for the world economy and for exporters elsewhere by growing so rapidly, albeit violating all the WTO rules, than, it would have had if it had been hemmed in into a kind of much more restrictive regulations that would have prevented it from diversifying its economy and growing so rapidly. And so, and vice versa. So I think that China also has to accept that the rules by which it has lived, which is that it can do whatever it wants, but the US and Western markets are always going to be open, or there is not going to be any restrictions on its ability to acquire technology, that's not sustainable, when China gets to be a large economy. So it really goes back to the GATT model, which is that I think the only kind of possible accommodation is a kind of peaceful coexistence between these alternative, very different economic models, where we recognize that they're not going to converge, and trying to integrate them deeply is simply a recipe for conflict and internal conflict and trade conflict. So it really, I think, is in fact the solution moving forward, is very much to move back to a kind of a more GATT-like model.